They fired a single dad over a lie, but nobody expected DHIS to pull up outside the building. 4 years of loyalty, erased in 4 minutes, and she never even looked him in the eye. One signature, one billionaire, one decision that was about to blow up in her face. 10 black SUVs, federal plates, and they were all here for the man she just fired. She froze, because the man she threw away was about to be honored as a hero in front of everyone.
If you've ever been judged unfairly by someone who never bothered to learn your name, this story is for you. Because what happens to Daniel Hayes in the next 20 minutes will remind you that the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes to rise. Before we begin, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by as many people as possible. And trust me, you do not want to miss the ending. Daniel Hayes was 37 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you would never guess the life he had lived before he became just another face in a gray warehouse uniform. He had sandy brown hair that he kept short and neat, a light stubble that he never quite found the time to shave clean, and blue-green eyes that carried a tiredness most people mistook for boredom. It was not boredom. It was the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 3 years raising his daughter alone, working double shifts, and quietly burying a part of himself that used to wear a uniform far different from the one he wore now. Every morning began the same way, in the small 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. Daniel would wake before the sun, start the coffee, and by the time 7-year-old Lily padded into the kitchen in her mismatched socks, there would be pancakes on the table, slightly lopsided, always shaped like something, a star, a heart, once even an attempt at a dinosaur that Lily insisted looked exactly like a stegosaurus. She would sit at the counter, swinging her legs, reciting her spelling words between bites, and Daniel would listen with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most important person in the world, because to him, she was. Lily's mother had passed away when Lily was 4, and in the years since, Daniel had rebuilt his entire life around one purpose: making sure his daughter never felt the absence as sharply as he did. He packed her lunches with little notes tucked inside the napkin. He walked her to the school gate every morning, no matter how tired he was, and waited until she disappeared through the doors before turning back toward his truck. He worked as a warehouse supervisor at Marsh Global Industries, a sprawling logistics and manufacturing company owned by one of the most talked-about businesswomen in the country, Elena Marsh. Elena Marsh had inherited the company from her father 12 years earlier and had since transformed it into a global empire worth billions. She was 44 years old, with platinum blonde hair, always pulled into a severe, low bun, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the color of ice that made boardrooms go quiet the moment she walked in. She was known for being brilliant, relentless, and almost impossibly composed. What most people did not see was the pressure she carried: quarterly earnings calls, a board of directors that scrutinized her every decision, and a growing sense that the empire her father built was becoming too large for any one person to fully oversee. Daniel had never met Elena Marsh in person. To him, she was a name on a paycheck, a face on the company newsletter, someone who existed in a different universe entirely. The top floor of Marsh Tower, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, while he spent his days on the warehouse floor among towering shelves of inventory, forklifts humming, and the constant rhythm of trucks pulling in and out of the loading docks. His closest friend at the company was Marcus Chen, a stocky, good-natured man in his early 30s who had worked alongside Daniel for 4 years. Marcus was the kind of coworker who remembered everyone's birthday and always saved the last donut for whoever looked like they needed it most. He and Daniel had developed an easy friendship built on shared coffee breaks, inside jokes about their supervisor's terrible taste in radio stations, and an unspoken loyalty that ran deeper than most workplace relationships ever did. Diane Ruiz ran human resources at the Marsh Global Distribution Center. She was in her late 30s, always composed in a navy blazer, and generally well-liked for being fair, if a little by the book. She had processed Daniel's promotion to shift supervisor 2 years earlier and had personally handed him an Employee of the Month plaque just 3 months before the story you'd about to hear took place. She liked Daniel. She respected his work ethic, which was exactly why what happened next felt so impossible to her, even as she was the one forced to deliver it. The trouble began quietly, the way trouble often does, in the office of Patricia Cole, the vice president of operations. Patricia was in her mid-40s, sharp and calculating, with dark auburn hair always styled, with precision and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. For years, Patricia had been skimming small amounts from the warehouse supply budget, inflated vendor invoices, phantom equipment orders, discrepancies buried so deep in spreadsheets that no one had noticed. No one, except that the company's new inventory software had recently begun flagging irregularities, and an internal audit was scheduled for the following month. Patricia needed someone to blame. She needed it to be someone with access to the records, someone whose termination would look routine rather than suspicious, and someone who would not have the resources or connections to fight back. Daniel Hayes, a single father with no legal team and no political power, fit the profile perfectly. Over the following weeks, Patricia worked with quiet precision. Late at night, alone in her office with the glow of her monitor the only light in the room, she altered digital inventory records, shifting dates and figures just enough to point toward Daniel's supervisor login. She printed falsified documents and shredded the originals. She made a phone call to Elena Marsh, her voice calm and concerned, mentioning irregularities in the East warehouse inventory that traced back to a supervisor named Daniel Hayes. Elena, buried under board meetings and a looming shareholder call, did not have time to dig deeply. She trusted Patricia. She had no reason not to. "I think we need to move quickly on this," Patricia said during a private meeting in Elena's glass-walled office, sliding a folder of fabricated evidence across the table. "The audit is in 3 weeks. If word gets out that we knew and did nothing, it reflects on you personally." Elena stared at the folder, at the photograph clipped to Daniel's personnel file, a man she had never met, smiling awkwardly for what must have been an ID badge photo. Something about it made her hesitate, but the numbers on the page, doctored as they were, looked damning. She thought of the board. She thought of the shareholders. And against the quiet unease in her chest, she signed the termination order. Diane received it the next morning, with a knot forming in her stomach. She had worked with Daniel for years. She had seen him stay late to help train new hires, seen him give up his lunch break to cover for a coworker whose kid was sick. None of this made sense to her, but the order came from the top, with Patricia's fabricated documentation attached, and Diane's hands were tied. She called Daniel into her office on a Thursday afternoon, her voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately put him on edge. He sat across from her, still in his warehouse polo, sleeves rolled up from a morning of inventory checks, completely unprepared for what was coming. "Daniel," Diane said, sliding a folder across the desk, unable to fully meet his eyes. "The company has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Daniel blinked. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. Terminate? What? Why? There are some discrepancies in the East warehouse inventory records. They've been traced to your login credentials. Diane's voice wavered slightly. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I don't have the authority to explain further than what's in the documentation. I didn't do this." His voice cracked, not from anger, but from disbelief. "Diane, you know me. You've known me for 4 years. Ask anyone on that floor. I've never taken a single thing that wasn't mine." "I know," she said quietly. And the honesty in her voice was the worst part of all. Because if she believed him, then someone else had made a terrible mistake, or worse, a terrible choice. But this decision came from executive leadership. I can't reverse it. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the termination papers, the words blurring slightly as his mind raced through the calculations every parent knows too well. Rent due in 9 days, Lily's dentist appointment next week, the truck payment, groceries, the school fundraiser she had been so excited about. He thought about all of it in the space of about 4 seconds, and somehow found the strength to stand up straight. Word traveled fast through the warehouse floor, the way it always does. By the time Daniel walked back toward his locker, the usual chatter and clanging of machinery had gone eerily quiet. Co-workers who had laughed with him just hours earlier now offered only sympathetic, uncertain glances, unsure what to say to a man who had clearly done nothing wrong, but was being walked out anyway. Marcus caught up with him near the lockers, his face tight with disbelief. "This is insane, man. Everyone knows you didn't do this. Let me talk to someone." "Don't," Daniel said, forcing a small, tired smile as he pulled his few belongings into a cardboard box. A photo of Lily, a coffee mug she had painted for him, a spare pair of work gloves. "It's not worth you getting in trouble too. I'll figure it out." But as he carried that box across the warehouse floor, past the shelves he had organized 100 times, past the loading dock where he had trained a dozen new employees, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, a hollow, sinking helplessness. He paused at the exit door and looked back once, at the only steady thing his life had had since Lily's mother passed away, and then he walked out into the parking lot. He sat in his truck for a long time before starting the engine, gripping the steering wheel, eyes closed, breathing slowly to keep the panic at bay. He thought about calling old contacts, about updating his resume, about how he would explain any of this to Lily without letting her see how frightened he actually was. When he finally drove home, the city lights blurred past the windshield, and for the first time in 3 years, Daniel Hayes did not know what came next. That evening, he made dinner and forced calm into his voice while Lily talked about her day, about a drawing she had made in art class. She was 7, but she was perceptive in the way that children raised by a single, attentive parent often are. "Are you sad, Daddy?" she asked, setting down her fork. Daniel knelt beside her chair and pulled her into a gentle hug. "I'm just tired, sweetheart, but I've got you, and that's all that matters." He meant it. Even in his lowest moment, that much was true. What Daniel did not know, what nobody at Marsh Global knew, except for a very small circle of people in Washington, was that 11 years earlier, before Lily was born, before the warehouse, before any of this, Daniel Hayes had served as a Navy hospital corpsman. On a rain-soaked night on a bridge outside Norfolk, Virginia, he had been the first responder to action arrive at a horrific car accident, a sedan that had spun off the wet road and crashed through the truck guardrail. Inside was a 17-year-old boy, unconscious, not breathing, trapped in the wreckage as freezing rain poured down. Daniel had pulled him free with his bare hands, performed CPR on the side of that bridge for nearly 6 minutes, and refused to stop until the boy's heart started beating again. That boy's name was Ethan Whitfield, and his father was James Whitfield, a rising political figure who would later become a senior cabinet official overseeing federal security operations. For years, the Whitfield family had tried to track down the young corpsman who saved Ethan's life that night, but Daniel had been discharged shortly afterward, moved twice, changed his phone number, and quietly disappeared into civilian life, never once mentioning the incident to anyone, not Marcus, not Diane, not even Lily's mother. He never considered himself a hero. He considered himself a man who had done his job. 2 days after Daniel's termination, on a Monday morning, Daniel returned to the Marsh Global, building one final time to collect a forgotten toolbox from his old locker, a small errand Diane had quietly arranged for him out of guilt. He stood in the parking lot around 9 in the morning when he heard it, a low, rhythmic rumble of engines, growing louder, closer. 10 black SUVs rounded the corner in tight, precise formation and pulled up directly outside Marsh Global's main entrance, arranging themselves in a line so exact it looked choreographed. Doors opened in unison. Men and women in dark suits stepped out, scanning the surroundings with practiced, alert eyes, one of them speaking quietly into a wrist microphone. Employees pressed against the windows upstairs, murmuring in confusion. Patricia Cole peered down from her office, her stomach twisting with a dread she couldn't yet explain. Elena Marsh emerged from her office moments later, drawn by the commotion, and walked briskly toward the lobby, heels clicking against the marble floor, utterly unprepared for what she was about to witness. Daniel stood frozen in the parking lot, gripping his toolbox, watching in stunned confusion as the rear door of the lead SUV opened and Secretary James Whitfield stepped out, dignified in a dark tailored suit, followed a moment later by a young man in his mid-20s, Ethan Whitfield, now grown, scanning the crowd with an intensity that silenced every whisper around him. Ethan's eyes swept across the parking lot and stopped on Daniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then recognition broke across Ethan's face like sunrise, and he walked briskly, then ran, closing the distance between them in seconds, and threw his arms around a man he had spent 11 years searching for. "It's you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I've been looking for you since I was 17 years old. You saved my life on that bridge, and I never even got to say thank you." Daniel stood there, stunned, the cardboard box of 2 days ago and the toolbox in his hands, feeling suddenly insignificant against the weight of a memory he had buried so long ago. I didn't know if you made it," he managed to say. "I never knew your name." Secretary Whitfield approached next, extending his hand, his eyes glistening with an emotion rarely seen on a man of his public composure. "Mr. Hayes, my son is alive today because of what you did on that bridge 11 years ago. My office has been trying to locate you for over a decade. When we finally traced your service record here, to this address, we came the moment we could." By now, a small crowd had gathered, employees, a few reporters, who had been tipped off about the secretary's public schedule, and Elena Marsh, standing frozen at the entrance, one hand rising slowly to cover her mouth as the pieces assembled themselves in her mind with sickening clarity. The man her company had fired 2 days earlier over fabricated theft allegations was the same man a sitting cabinet secretary had crossed the country to personally honor. Just then, Lily came running from across the lot. Diane had called Daniel earlier that morning to say there was something important happening, and in a small, quiet act of loyalty, she had picked Lily up from school early and brought her, sensing somehow that her father needed her there. Lily threw her arms around Daniel's waist, and Secretary Whitfield knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Your daddy is a hero," he told her gently. "One of the bravest men I have ever known." Meanwhile, Marcus had not been idle. Furious over Daniel's termination, and suspicious of Patricia's sudden urgency to push it through, he had spent the last 2 days quietly gathering information, cross-referencing warehouse login timestamps with the security footage archive. What he found confirmed what everyone who knew Daniel had already believed. The inventory discrepancies had originated from a separate terminal, one accessed under an administrative override that only a handful of people in the building could use. Patricia Cole's badge had logged into that terminal at 11:47 p.m. on 3 separate nights. Marcus stepped forward through the crowd, folder in hand, and found Elena just as she was beginning to process the magnitude of her mistake. "Ms. Marsh, I need you to see this," he said, holding out the tablet with the security logs displayed clearly. "Daniel didn't touch those records. Patricia did." Elena's expression shifted from disbelief to a cold, clarifying fury. She turned sharply, scanning the crowd until she found Patricia attempting to slip quietly back toward the lobby doors. "Patricia," Elena said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. "We need to talk. Now." Patricia's practiced composure finally cracked as security personnel, following Elena's sharp gesture, gently blocked her path. Diane stepped forward as well, confirming what she had quietly suspected all along, that the termination order had been built on falsified evidence pushed through under pressure from Patricia's office. Within the hour, Patricia Cole was escorted from the building, her career at Marsh Global over, an internal investigation and likely criminal referral already set in motion. Elena walked directly to Daniel, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the composed, unshakable CEO of Marsh Global Industries did not know exactly what to say. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "I am so sorry. I let you down as an employee and as a human being. I signed a decision that ended your livelihood without ever taking the time to look you in the eye and hear your side. That's on me, not just Patricia." "I appreciate that," Daniel said quietly, still holding Lily against his side. "But it wasn't just about my job. It was about my daughter's stability, about being able to look her in the eye and tell her hard work matters. It does matter, Elena said. And I intend to prove that to you, starting today. She extended her hand. I'd like to reinstate you immediately, with a promotion to Regional Operations Manager, full back pay, and, if you're willing to have me, my personal apology, publicly, to every employee in this building. Daniel considered her for a long moment, then shook her hand. Not because the offer erased what had happened, but because he understood, perhaps better than anyone in that parking lot, that people are allowed to make things right when they choose to. The following weeks brought changes to Marsh Global that rippled far beyond Daniel's Cannes own story. Elena implemented a new internal review policy requiring any termination to go through a documented, independent verification process, a policy employees began calling, half-jokingly, Daniel's Law. She began spending more time on the warehouse floor herself, something she had never done in 12 years of running the company, determined never again to sign her name to a decision she hadn't personally understood. Daniel returned to work 3 days later, not as a supervisor this time, but as a manager overseeing operations across 4 regional distribution centers, with an office of his own, and a raise that finally let him breathe a little easier at the end of each month. Marcus was promoted alongside him, a reward for his loyalty and sharp instincts. Diane, though shaken by the experience, remained at HR, now armed with new authority to question decisions that didn't sit right with her. As for Secretary Whitfield and Ethan, they stayed in touch. Ethan visited Daniel and Lily more than once over the following months, and on the anniversary of the accident each year, he made it a point to call, just to say thank you, just to remind Daniel that the 6 minutes he spent on that rain-soaked bridge had rippled forward into an entire life that would not exist without him. Months later, on a warm evening in the park near their apartment, Daniel pushed Lily on the swings as the golden light of sunset spread across the grass. She laughed, the easy, uncomplicated laugh of a child who felt safe and loved. And Daniel realized, watching her, that everything he had ever done, every double shift, every packed lunch with a hidden note, every quiet sacrifice nobody saw, had been leading toward moments exactly like this one. He had spent years believing that his greatest act of heroism was long behind him, buried on a bridge in the rain. But standing in that park, pushing his daughter toward the sky, Daniel understood the truth. Heroism was never a single moment. It was every ordinary day he showed up, for her, without needing anyone to notice at all. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, Daniel sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, looking out at the quiet street. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, a photo of the new Daniel's Law plaque mounted near the warehouse entrance, with a simple message underneath it, "Proud of you, man." Daniel smiled, set the phone down, and let himself simply breathe for a moment, something he realized he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. He thought about the version of himself who had walked out of that building 2 days earlier, certain his world was collapsing, and he thought about how close he had come to giving up hope that things could still turn around. They always could, he realized now. Sometimes it just took longer and cost more than anyone deserved to pay, but it always could. For Elena, the lesson would take longer to fully settle, but it changed the way she led from that day forward. She began holding quarterly town halls where any employee could speak to her directly, with no managers filtering the questions beforehand. She kept a printed copy of Daniel's old employee badge photo in her desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder of how easily power, left unchecked by patience, could crush the very people holding an organization together. When new executives joined Marsh Global, she told them Daniel's story herself, every single time, because she believed the only way to prevent another Patricia Cole was to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly what was at stake when they signed their names to a decision about someone else's life. Sometimes the world takes its time to reward quiet integrity. Sometimes it takes a fired job, a devastating 2 days, and 10 black SUVs pulling up out of nowhere to remind everyone watching that the truth does not stay buried forever. If this story moved you even a little, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like Daniel's, waiting to be told, stories about the quiet, unnoticed people who turn out to be the strongest ones in the room all along.